Welcome to Conversation on Value, a podcast on Traces and Dreams about reframing value in business and society. I'm your host, Valeria Maltoni. In this episode, we'll explore the question of value in history with Jacob Soll. Soll is professor of philosophy, history, and accounting at the University of Southern California. Conversation on Value is a podcast about how to reframe value in business and society. I'm Valeria, and I've been working on the question of value for more than 20 years. So welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join the podcast. And I was curious, the first thing I was curious about was the intersection of philosophy, history, and accounting in your background and in your title. Can you tell me a little bit how you got to that crossroads?
Sure. Well, thank you, Valeria. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure. It actually started because I study states historically and how they work and don't work. And what I would do is, it's not unlike a doctor who dissects a body. I go into a state, I go into its archives. One of the most important states in the history of the world is the French state in the 17th century under Jean-Baptiste Colbert, because he does state building. Many people get upset about states. They think we have too much states. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, we didn't have stable states. So people were working very, very hard to build them. So people were state building. And that goes into the 18th century. For example, the United States, they worked really hard to build a state because they didn't have one. Without a state, you don't have peace, you don't have credit, you don't have anything. So states are pretty important. They can be scary, but they can also be good. And so I was in the archives of Colbert, and I was digging around, and I just kept finding these account books everywhere. And then I started finding correspondence talking about the account books. And then I found correspondence between Colbert and Louis XIV, in which Colbert actually was teaching Louis XIV double entry accounting using a manuscript version of Pacioli's. It was possibly from Pacioli's book. It could have been from another accounting manual because there were so many. And Colbert had actually written it in French, in manuscript, for Louis XIV. Louis XIV was writing Colbert saying, wow, this is really interesting. Then I find a letter from Louis XIV to his mother, Anne of Austria, saying, double entry accounting is really hard, but it's so interesting. And I can really see how important this is for statecraft. And as I looked through Colbert's policies, I saw this enormous effort to create a central ledger. And I'm writing about this now, a balance sheet for the state. And so I was sort of surprised. I thought, this is unusual because there's not a little here. There's a fair amount about the importance of accounting and accounting standards in state building, and no one had written about that before. And so what I did is I went back to other sort of central archives that I knew in states, and I kept finding that the people who were building states at important times, or in the case of Cosimo de' Medici, taking down a state, he destroyed the Florentine Republic, but he did so with a lot of skill. Double entry accounting was key in all these state building enterprises. And in fact, recently I've talked to economists who worked with the Chinese during their period of vast economic expansion. And one of the most senior Americans to work with the Chinese government on building their economic reforms said accountants were everywhere. They were everywhere. And so when the Chinese from the 80s to 10 years ago were on their the greatest wealth expansion and creation in human history, accountants were in the front seat. They were doing a huge amount. So this hasn't changed. And so I ended up writing a book, which actually I've got right here because I'm writing from it, a new book, The Reckoning, Financial Accountability and the Rise and Fall of Nations, about how central accounting was to state building, and how that when we see financial crises and states falling apart, you often find poor accounting as central to those crises as well.
Okay, which leads me, it's interesting because you mentioned Cosimo de' Medici, and I was thinking as you were talking about Pacioli about the city-state and how in Italy city-states had the highest degree of literacy, both in mathematics as well as in reading and in the humanities, in the at least the Western world at the time. So I was sort of going back to that time and thinking it's a double-edged sword, because then, it's a tool that can be used, as every tool, for good or for evil. And I was thinking about how certain states eventually managed, right, through the centuries, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, eventually they got to the point where they started creating scale and standardization around the type of tools that they use to build the state, right? The tariffs, the subsidies, the state monopolies. And how in your book, the free market, which is part of the reason why I wanted to talk with you, is you mentioned how this led to political repression. And I was curious about that, because it seems like the balance went all the way to, the pendulum swung all the way to the other side.
This is the problem in, I think, some of modern economic theory, especially in modern, what I'd call orthodox free market thought, is a paranoia about the state in general. The idea that Hayek and Friedman have, that any state allocation of resources is somehow the road to totalitarianism. It can be, but it's also necessary. So this is the problem. There's no easy answer here. If you take the example of Colbert, who's the great standardizer, he works to centralize the French government, to standardize weights and measures, to create stamps of quality for French woolen and textile products, which, by the way, end up helping to create the French market and allow France to be the second commercial state after Britain. He does so repressively, with repression. And if you go back in the English history, which we've been told is a kind of history of liberalism, there's plenty of repression in there too, and the state is pretty rough. I mean, the English depend on their navy, and they go in and they have press gangs and they pull boys off the streets and force them into the navy. I mean, it's not like a friendly liberal, 20th century liberal society. That's not what the 17th and 18th or even the 16th centuries are. The problem is that in England, we do have a more open state, and in Holland, we see that as well. And even in the Italian city-states, and particularly in Tuscany, we see a certain level of political openness, which does seem to mirror a possibility of growth mixed with high levels of literacy. That's actually what I find to be the real ticket to sustained wealth creation, not for 70 years, but for longer. You just have very literate populations. But sometimes, yes, you'll see the state come in and force these things on people. Sometimes this is terrible and unproductive. Other times it seems to work. I mean, let's be honest, the Chinese wealth creation system was based on liberalizing certain areas, but there were state companies and repressive rules all around that. So these are very hard questions to figure out. Is having a powerful state bad? Well, not in Singapore. It's a very powerful state. It owns a state holding company. It creates a lot of wealth. It leaves alone certain other companies. There's always these odd balances. So what I've found is that when it comes to states creating the conditions for markets, there are always conditions, right? And every state and every situation is different. The situation of Tuscany and how its economy grew is just completely organic and unique. The situation of how the Dutch Republic or the Netherlands became really the richest place of its time, right after the sort of high point of the Italian city-states. That's another really particular story. Then the story of the rise of England, the rise of Spain and Portugal, the rise of Germany's. Each one of these is particular, and in each case, you will see in these countries that become wealthy a particular road to market building, with sometimes the state playing a bigger role, sometimes a lesser role. But I have not found one case where the state is not heavily involved in market building in one way or another. And I can give you the specifics of any country because I've generally studied them.
I was really pleased with the contextual framing of the argument, but also the the wealth of detail in your book. And I wanted to, because this is a conversation mostly on the value in history, I wanted to go to something that is more transversal to these states and societies, which is the role of the church in laying the foundation for the modern state.
Right.
So talk to me a little bit about that, because
the church is the modern state. I mean, everyone has to realize that the Roman Empire might have fallen, but it's still here. There's still an emperor. He still sits on a throne in Rome. The Pope is still the emperor of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire never really stops. It falls as a giant administrative framework. The church steps in the 500s, 600s, 700s with Pope Gregory. And without the actual secular state, the church steps in to the public squares and to the forums of the Roman Empire. And by the way, many of the temples and forums become churches. We see this all across Europe. All you have to do, if you want to understand the history of humanity, go to Sicily and look at a couple churches. Usually they're Greek temples that become Roman temples, that become Christian churches, that become cathedrals, and sometimes mosques in between. And they're all built on top of each other, literally. So if you truly do want to understand this realistically, you can go to Sicily and just dig around in some churches in Sicily. So the church is the state in Europe, and there are endless arguments really until the beginning of the 17th century of whether the Catholic Church is the actual authority and has dominion over the West or not. In the beginning of the 17th century, the church really loses its temporal power. But until then, it oversees enormous parts of people's lives. Actually, in 18th century France, the church is still putting people on trial in a secular state. So, and the French crown is working very, very hard to make sure that church power is French and not Roman. I mean, these fights go on really until the 19th century. But so the church is very important for a whole bunch of reasons, because the church has to understand, the church is not just there to make sure that the roads and the tolls work. And that's not so much what they do. They're there to make sure that things happen according to canon law and to theological demands. So, for example, pricing is supposed to be moral. Desire is supposed to be controlled within religious frameworks. So one of the great theses of free market thought is that it's driven on human desire, demand and supply. People want things, and the market then responds and gives them to them. Christianity, and this, remember, Christianity changes over time, and the Christianity of today bears very little resemblance to early Christianity, to medieval Christianity, to early modern Christianity. It's a vast and enormous history, and even before the Reformation, there are many, many different churches within the church. But one of the most important tenets of most of the great monotheistic religions and also other polytheistic religions is the managing of human desire and keeping it away from too much flesh and too much material desire. And Christianity is the first to actually, and this is St. John of Chrysostom, to actually frame the idea of salvation in market terms. The idea that humans have these desires for gold and for bodily pleasures, and also food, even laughter, these things. But if you're really pious and you really want salvation, you have to actually channel all that desire purely into salvation itself and a love for God. And so this Christian model of harnessing desire purely for spiritual ends is a huge tension of the church. It doesn't fully work. And so when the fathers of the church, between the year, I would say, actually the first century AD up into the 400s, when the fathers of the church are writing, they're demanding total asceticism, virginity, celibacy, and giving up all of your earthly goods to the poor and to the church, all of them. Some fathers of the church say you shouldn't even have children. You should just be focused on the afterlife. You should give as much money away as you can, or later, some like Augustine say, look, we're going to need Christian families to have successful farms so that they can make money to pay into the church so the church can survive. That's actually a step forward. But in the Middle Ages, the church now has to contend with the fact that Europe has become richer, that you have these fabulously wealthy towns, and that the leaders of these Italian city-states are merchants. And suddenly you have this incredible tension between wealthy merchants and the old values of the church, which are poverty and asceticism, which come together in the Franciscan order. And the Franciscans have to make a vow of total poverty. And then their question becomes, how do we maintain a vow of total poverty in an age, in a place of trade and vast wealth? And that becomes this question which leads them to try and understand how to value everything. A book, for example, is this an object that you own, or is this a tool of spirituality and utility that has no other value? So are you committing mortal sin as a Franciscan by taking a vow of total poverty by owning a book? No, only if you use the book for spiritual ends. But if you just own it for ownership's sake, that could actually send you to hell. So they start trying to understand the market forces behind valuation. It's a fascinating story.
Yes, I love the detail that you brought in about the fact that money itself didn't have actual value, but it was what it provided access to. When a lot of it feels like a lot of the contemporary conversation or narrative is around money being the end itself. So I thought, wow, we've come a long way to be still debating this question of what is value.
Well, I mean, it is an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, from Aristotle into the church fathers and late antiquity, there's an idea that money is nothingness, that without an exchange, without a corresponding thing that you get, it actually has no intrinsic value and is therefore evil, because nothingness is actually, within Christianity, according to certain theology, it's evil. So if you trade money for money, that is just a sort of evil thing. Now, later theorists will say, actually, if you do one sin against another sin, it cancels the sin out. And those are some of the first actual free market thinkers that believe just exchange will cancel out all the sins. You have to realize that within Christianity, there's the idea of the Garden of Eden and original sin. And I don't think most people realize that within Christian theology, property and work were considered the punishment of humankind for the destruction of the Garden of Eden, where man and woman did not have to work. All was provided. Nothing was owned. All was held in common. It was heavenly communism. Eve bites the apple, everything's ruined, and then you're forced to own things and to work for them. And those are considered punishments. Now, later Christianity will have to work with that and turn them into something positive, but it's not considered positive at first. So,
which is interesting, and it brings me back to the question around the historical roots between money and capital, and the significance of these two different concepts in our current narrative.
I mean, this takes me back to the Franciscans, who again fascinate me. And there's a chapter on their thought. The Franciscans accept that there's money and that there are objects and that there are things that we own. And what they realize, and many of the more sophisticated Franciscans are very radical thinkers. They are clearly opposed to the church being the greatest landowner of the time. They're opposed to the church's vast wealth. And so what they start saying is, look, in the Bible, it says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and that Caesar is supposed to look over these things, and that secular people are the only ones. The church shouldn't be getting involved with trying to price things. That's not what the church knows. The church knows what sins are and good works are, but the price of something is actually what merchants know, because merchants are the ones that acquire capital and invest capital and understand the value of their own work and understand risk. This is what these Franciscan thinkers say. It's unbelievable, because no one has really said this before. And why are they saying this? They're saying this, A, to try and understand their own vow of poverty so that they don't commit mortal sin, but also to subvert the church as a center of wealth. I mean, before the Reformation and secularization, there was just church history. Okay. And so within the church, there are these incredible radicals. And you take William of Ockham and Duns Scotus. I mean, these are radical, visionary thinkers, but they see that money, there are value, capital has value. They use the word capital, and you can invest it and it will create more wealth. And according to certain parts of the Bible and St. Luke, that's a good thing. Money has to move like water. Or St. Matthew, money must be invested. It cannot just sit. And they start to look to understand this process of who adds value to things. And that's super fascinating.
Yes, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about how today we use capital in conjunction with human capital, social capital, intellectual capital. And it's this idea of value in use, something that you bring to bear to a situation, and it's the accumulated energy of that work and knowledge that comes from it. So I was thinking maybe those radicals did us a favor by engaging with these questions all those years ago.
No, listen, this is not some small thing. There are arguments amongst medievalists. I have medievalist friends who've said, look, good chapter, but we're not convinced how influential this was. I'm like, yeah, it's influential because the church starts writing decrees. There's consciousness about this. What's very interesting is that the idea that a merchant through expertise can create wealth is a radical idea. So these are the first people to actually recognize a brain economy, so that the expertise and all the knowledge that a merchant might have, and that knowledge will be tides, it will be different cities, it will be ports, it will be currencies, it will be different products, it will be markets, all these things. This is what the merchant can bring into the value of something. In the 16th century, and I'm not sure, I think I do write about this in the book. You have to understand that during this period outside of northern Italy, the Netherlands, and then some big cities across Europe, all money comes from agriculture, all wealth. And so does nobility, so does social status. The merchant outside of northern Italy and the northern Netherlands and the cities of the Netherlands is a third-class citizen, neither a priest, neither a soldier or a lord, but someone that makes money. In the Middle Ages, the Franciscans call them paupers. A businessman is a pauper because in spite of all their expertise, they're looking to make money, and nothing could bring you more poverty than that, right? That's the saddest thing. Necessary for society, but to quest after money shows a poverty of the soul, right? So they call them paupers. But what happens is thinkers in the 16th century, and this is also radical, start saying, look, money doesn't come from God just giving us the seasons and giving us plants and crops, which we have to manage, which gets back to Cicero's classical agrarian theories of wealth and virtue. No, actually, it's the people of the cities who are artificers. And artificers can create wealth from making things and from expertise and from artificiality. That goes right into church law and to others who say, look, artificial wealth is immoral and it's evil. It comes from cities. The idea is that the most noble thing you can do is work the ground. And Giovanni Botero, writing in the 16th century, writes, no, actually, the greatest thing you can do is have a city. The city itself is an organism of wealth. It's expertise and it's artifice. And then it has all these laws and institutions that will create wealth too. That argument will go all the way into the 19th century. Adam Smith says cities create wealth, but all wealth has to come from agriculture first. Botero says in the 16th century, this isn't true. All the Italian thinkers are writing, no. Industry and expertise, and that's what Florence is all about, is the work can produce much more than a single pair of hands. And so you have these opposing theories of wealth creation, manufacturing and artifice, or farming and farm labor. And Smith, I contend and can give you the quotes, doesn't understand modern capitalism and doesn't understand wealth creation. And these earlier Italians do, which is why they invent capitalism. I mean, it's not, Protestants don't invent capitalism. Italian Catholics do. And so they also think about it a lot. And as we go into the 16th and 17th centuries, the most important market thinkers that you've never heard of, but they're in my book, are talking about market mechanisms because they live in these urban centers, which are quite old, and have theorized manufacturing, the work of artisans, right? An artisan is an artificer. That's Leonardo da Vinci. Remember, da Vinci works in a shop. He's a goldsmith. Most of the great Renaissance artists start as goldsmiths. Da Vinci teaches ancient Latin to his workers while inventing forms of modern physics and some of the greatest art in the world before he runs away to France.
Yeah, but you brought together a couple of different elements that I wanted to touch upon a little bit, because I think that's what created the context and the conditions for this awareness. You talked about cities and city centers, and we've already said in the Middle Ages, Italy was filled with city-states, and there was a high level of literacy, in numeracy and literacy. There was a lot of agriculture around the cities because, you know, people had to eat, and there is a lot of cultivable land. Italy has tons and tons of variety of different, you know, crops and different environments. But what's interesting is if you look at the history of these cities, which I'm sure you have, there were canals in the cities. You know, Bologna had canals, Modena had canals, you know, some of the big valley cities had canals. And so there was a lot of commerce going on and movement of goods between the countryside and the city. And out of the city was coming the craft. They taking the raw materials and creating the textiles that would go. In fact, the mills were, you know, a big deal in Italian cities at the time. So all of these elements came together, and to an observant person, this creates awareness of how they all feed the mechanism that creates the commerce and the wealth.
Well, no, but see, that's very Smithian. That is only partially true. You have much richer fields in France without those cities. So you have to understand that Italy is the most densely populated place in the Middle Ages. I mean, you have cities of, I have the list somewhere, dozens of cities of more than 10,000 people, numerous cities of 40, 50, 160, 200,000 people in the late Middle Ages. Italy is every 30 miles, or 50 kilometers, you have a huge city. This countryside in the rest of Europe is not producing this kind of wealth. What's happening is you have very nice agriculture, but it's going into cities that are so innovative that they're taking whatever that agriculture is and they're doing much, 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 much more because they're creating things. You also have an urban governmental system from Siena to all these cities, which is creating the conditions through bonds. So they have bond markets, they have banks, they have insurance, right? They have special hospitals which are funded. And I mean, the history of the Tuscan hospital system is really, really extensive, right? It's not just banks, it's hospitals, it's canals, it's rivers, it's ports. So what you have is this visionary system of going much further than other places were going in the Middle Ages by using agricultural wealth, sure, but by creating wealth in these cities, which has enormous plus value by what we would have to call medieval manufacturing. If you take Adam Smith, he talks about a pin factory. I looked at the description of the pin factory in medieval Italy, that would have been considered quite primitive. It's nothing modern about Smith's pin factory. Take the Arsenale in Venice. I mean, in 1345, this is a factory which is a third the size. It's a huge part of Venice. Is just this boat factory. They're doing everything there. When the great states, whether it be England or France or Holland, are interested in how they too can become maritime powers, everyone visits the Arsenale. They want to see this industrial production that's happening. It's medieval, but it's extraordinary. By the way, they're also using tools like double entry bookkeeping, and the Arsenale is run on double entry bookkeeping or something very close to it. That's extraordinary. So what it shows is artifice, management, all these different things that makes Italy, for a time, the richest place in Europe by a huge, huge marker. And add to that, for example, populations that are remarkably not only literate, but incredibly skilled.
So that's interesting, because in your book, you provide an example, and I would think the government obviously had, and the bureaucracy had a large part in, kind of keeping accounts and keeping track of everything that was happening. And you have one example. Now, of course, this was built on the cities, Italian cities were built on the physical infrastructures that the Roman Empire built, right? Absolutely. The Roman camps, which, the Roman army doubled as the Corps of Engineers. They had now we discovered the self-healing cement that they created to build these aqueducts and, all this. So I was interested in, when you spoke in the book about the common's role in building infrastructure, you mentioned the Netherlands or Holland as the place where that happened. And I wondered if you had looked at differences or how that came about.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, look, first of all, Italy always has this foot up the imperial city of the 5th century, the 6th century.
Ravenna?
You have to go to Ravenna to understand the Roman Empire, once again, never stops. That you're sitting there in the 500s and you have a full standing city of the Roman Empire sitting in Ravenna. I don't think people understand that until you've been there and seen it. You go, oh my God, so wait, the Roman Empire actually just never fell. It was functioning at one place or another. You had, however, if you go to Rome, and I show one of my favorite museums in Rome is the Crypta Balbi, which is from the theater of Balbus, which is a theater, and the museum shows how after the fall of Rome, the theater sort of breaks down, a village is built around the theater, and by the time we get to late antiquity, it's a pig farm that's just a several minute walk from the Roman Forum. Rome might collapse as a city, but Ravenna is still there. All these different cities are there. They have temples. If you go to Siena, why does Siena have a square shape like that? Because it's a Roman theater. I mean, you've got huge infrastructure. You've got all these rocks and stones that later become the building blocks of the Middle Ages, literally. Now, Holland doesn't have that. Holland, in the year 1000, doesn't have all these already built Roman roads and things that are standing that they can work with and build with. They are on a giant salt marsh surrounded by water. And in the 1100s and 1200s, they start draining the marshes and creating land out of that. This is completely unique as far as asset management. I'm writing about this today, actually, to take basically these marshes and lakes and deltas. And by the way, the Venetians do a bit of this too. But the Dutch do it. The Venetians take their lagoon to escape from people, and they create this sort of Venetian island, which becomes really, there's more art per square foot in Venice than any place in the world, to create for a time the richest place in the world and the longest lasting stable republic in human history, more than 700 years, until Napoleon destroys it. But the Dutch come at this really kind of with nothing in the year 1000. They start pulling water out of the land. They start creating these very, very productive farms, but they also start building these commercial cities that, like Venice, are separate from the mainland, safer, where you start having merchants existing in Northern Europe outside the total control of agrarian noblemen. And they create a commercial society. And that's another one of these things that we're still trying to figure out how it happens. How is it that you can create this very wealthy society sort of out of nothing? What I'm writing about today is that, not unlike the Italians, in order to run all the waterworks that were necessary to keep the land above water, you had to have all these municipal institutions, and all of them used, whether it be single entry accounting or double entry accounting, people were constantly accounting and managing using numbers and engineering. So literacy. At this, you want to talk about market creation, right? And they're always getting in fights. The managers will take on debt that other people have to pay. There are lawsuits. And what you see is this sort of remarkable creation of a commercial society out of literally land reclamation. It's a kind of extraordinary story. And by the time we get to the 1400s, the late 1400s, Holland is becoming richer than Northern Italy. But that's because it's doing international trade, starting to do sort of vast international trade by the time we get to the early 1500s through the Spanish Empire. But it looks a lot like Italy. You have a kind of urban ethos. You have a certain amount of individual liberty. You have very knowledgeable governments and institutions, which are quite sophisticated. So these things are very, very interesting. We've been fascinated by them for so long, but also myths have been created around them that somehow it was just individual freedoms that created this. No. There was repression. There were heavy-handed noble governments. There were all these things, literacy, expertise, urban government, all these things come to create these markets, essentially.
It seems to me that these are the themes really that weave their way through your argument in the book, because you go back hundreds of years and then you keep bringing up there's the confluence of these 3-4 elements that work in conjunction with each other to create and build wealth. And I think there is also a dimension in the context. You talked about it when you talked about Italian cities, that is the culture, and how culture, how commerce is steeped in culture. Really, there is a relationship between the two.
This is something that I really stand by. One of the things I did a long time ago is I was just interested, and these are very sort of superficial things. I was just like, I want to go back and look at these richest places in the West that I can study, right? That I can understand, and look at their periods of wealth creation. And one of the things I found is that Northern Italy, by the way, most people don't understand that Northern Italy was and remains one of the richest places in the world, even with the challenges, with the staggering challenges that Italy faces. Northern Italy is still vastly wealthy. Most people don't understand that most of the designs of automobiles and moving things that come to them come from Northern Italy still. It's a center of design and technology working out of places around Milan and Turin. It's just staggering. These have always been centers of wealth creation. Well, how is that possible? And one of the things that you find is that you need a certain level of political freedom. And I have found that really, I would say, absolutist style states do not seem to be able to hold on to wealth creation for long periods of time. That you need innovation, you need fighting in society, you need lots of fighting and arguing and lawsuits, you need the rule of law, you need a turnover in power, you need all these things for wealth to kind of innovate and keep going. This is, but by the way, I can tell you the story of Britain in the 18th century. They're able to make reforms that are so sophisticated, no other states doing this in the 18th century, that they almost have a French Revolution. They have the Gordon riots in the 1780s, which burns down half of London, but they're able to do some reforms which calm things down so that Britain, many people want a French Revolution in Britain and they don't get one. So one of the things that we see are these places that are incredibly dynamic, have a bit of open government. It's not what we would consider today, but they do have a bit of open government. They have a bit of representative government and the rule of law. And there's another thing that I have to say that I constantly am finding in these moments of remarkable wealth creation: incredible literacy and a connection with the arts and schooling. So if you go, obviously Renaissance Tuscany is just startling. And one of the things I try and teach my students, we don't completely understand where it comes from, but there is one tradition in and around Florence that we don't see that many other places in Europe, and that's wealthy families and institutions will just decide to educate a poor person. It's a strange Tuscan tradition. Many of the most famous artists were actually educated because you had a young nobleman and they played with them in their village, the son of a butcher. Read Vasari, The Lives of the Artists, and you'll hear about these stories. And so the noble family will then just educate the butcher's son, and the butcher's son becomes a great artist, or an artisan first and then a great artist, because this literacy and technical capacity go together. One of the things, and Da Vinci's the easy shot, right? He's an artisan, he has a goldsmith shop, he's learning humanist Latin, he's doing physics, he's studying everything. He's one of these super geniuses. But most of these people that you study who at the time are innovating and doing amazing things are either doing it connected to these humanistic enterprises or surrounded by it. And when we get to the Dutch Golden Age, the reason, and this is something I can't prove, but I am completely convinced that the reason that the Dutch are so good at financial management, accounting, and business is because their society is permeated by thinking about it. So the society is filled with artworks about accounting. Even in Renaissance Italy, we only have a few accounting paintings. There are all these Dutch masters that are paintings of accounting, but not just of how powerful accounting is, but how risky it is. And that's extremely important. So if you don't do accounting well, or if you think that you've got everything under control, you'll make an error. If you have hubris, you can lose it all. And if you walk around these Dutch cities or Flemish cities like Bruges, you're going to see public artworks in churches, which will explain to you the power of, for example, double entry bookkeeping and the dangers of thinking that it alone will save you. It's not just that. It's actually religion, art, civic values, for example. And so when we see these places that create wealth for hundreds of years, it's because it's based on a bedrock of education, literacy, art, and then financial literacy as well. There is a strong cultural bedrock. This is quite concerning when we get to today, because I have not seen healthy, long, when I say healthy, that's obviously relative, right? But when you see these places, sorry, this is just an aside, but when I was living in Florence for a long time, one of my best friends was Portuguese, and he was an antique collector. And he always said, it's just unbelievable, the antique markets in Florence. The place has been rich for so long that there's so much stuff floating around that if you know it, if you understand it, you can always find amazing stuff in Florence at the flea markets. You can always do it. You still, until a few years ago, I was still doing it. In Portugal, my friends would say it was so much poorer. There's just not as much stuff. Now you can buy some church art, and I have some over there from Portugal, but it just doesn't have this vast, long period of wealth that just continues and continues. And that wealth is also culture of producing art, one artistic movement after the next. If you look, for example, at the history of painting in Florence, there are phenomenal painters in the 1930s. There are famous sculptors. The place was never not culturally rich. Now, how do you get that? It's a mixture of commercial knowledge, but also a huge valorization of the humanities and the arts and the sciences all as one together. Oh,
sorry. It's interesting. You talk about Leonardo da Vinci a lot. I know Michelangelo a lot better. If you can know somebody who lived such a long time ago. And I always think about how he had to build relationships with these wealthy people, because see the way, so the rich people, wealthy people may have taught the poor people who had skill, and educated them. And then in reverse, these artists were there to celebrate the greatness of these wealthy people. And so Michelangelo, right, was commissioned these statues from popes and from rich people, and he had to keep in their graces. And it was not only the artist who would find the shape in the marble, but it was also the guy who had to eat, and he had to source the block of marble without breaking it, to get it to a place where he could carve it. So there was a lot of you talk about accounting, but there was a lot of operational smart that had to go into making this stuff happen.
You have to understand the sophistication of these societies. I remember one of the most famous scholars in France, a member of the Académie Française, a good friend of mine, Marc Fumaroli. And we would always sit in his apartment at the Académie Française, and we'd look over the works of the ministries around Colbert. And he would say, do you understand how sophisticated these government ministers were? Their understanding of art, their understanding of culture. Even when someone like Colbert couldn't speak Latin, he was still probably the greatest collector of Latin books outside of the Vatican, just as a single person. Just literally unbelievable. The sophistication, the vision. I try and teach that to my students, to say what existed in this period coming out of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the early modern period was this valuing of deep knowledge, of slow knowledge. One of the other things we get in Italy is the rise of a new value system coming out of Neoplatonic Christianity. And then some people were just Neoplatonists in Florence. There were some aristocratic pagans around the Rucellai Gardens in the Quattrocento, was the value of the creator. And this gets back to Michelangelo and people like Cosimo de' Medici and Donatello. The fact that you would value someone who could create more than anyone else because they represented God's power. And that's the Sistine Chapel, is literally God touching, very muscular, good-looking God and a very muscular, good-looking man touching each other with a brain in the background, giving the spark of creation to mankind. And this is this Neoplatonic idea, right, of the brain, of the sophistication of the philosopher God and the philosopher people who can create knowledge, and that this knowledge is the most valuable thing in the world. And what you had then was this huge patronage network, which moves beyond the medieval patronage, where you had churches paying people without names to build beautiful things. You had famous artists. Cosimo de' Medici, for example, valued Donatello as someone who he thought had some very spiritual gifts, more than normal people. And we got this value system where the creators were extremely valuable people. And this is something that when German artists come to Italy, they can't believe how well they're treated by princes, for example, because they are artists. And the artist is someone who's closer to God, the philosopher, the artist, even the scholar. And so this value system, which I believe sort of existed up until 40 years ago, where these artists and people of the mind were considered really important, now in our new tech economy, believe it or not, which is a brain economy, doesn't seem to value, in market terms, culture in the same way that we have valued it really since the 1400s in Europe.
And how do you feel that is helping or hindering us in moving forward in our current spot or in our current predicament?
I mean, one of the things that I know, my father's a molecular geneticist, and he said the great geneticists and biologists usually had backgrounds in the humanities and classical music, and were able to do a lot of creative thinking through their knowledge of the arts and history and these vast sort of expansive visions of humanity. By the way, I mean, I hate to say this, I live in Los Angeles, but San Francisco is not a cultural hub. It has more money flowing through it than you can believe. That money is not producing culture. It has some great universities, but it's not a place you go to learn. Well, you go there for certain things, but it's not a great hub. Los Angeles and all of its messiness is a sort of greater artistic center than that. But I'm really concerned because my students are absolutely wonderful, but they don't know history usually, and they don't have a sense of the historical past. And even a simplistic sense gives you a sense of where we've come from, where we're going, a sense of art, a sense of the evolution of art, the evolution of culture. That used to be very normal. Everyone who was educated knew that stuff. Now, that was very elitist, fine, I get that argument, but it also gave people sort of tools to understand humanity while they were making money and building things. I don't see that now at the top of the economic ladder. I work with many business leaders, and they're wonderful, brilliant people, but compared to the generation of my grandparents, for example, and I knew business leaders from that period too, from the post-war period, they understood the importance of education much more, of general education, of culture, and they were much more cultured. And I believe that allowed them to make more humane decisions. Now, people are going to say, oh, that's some kind of elitist cliche, but no, I really stand by it from what I've seen. You can get fascism and horrific totalitarian communism from those cultures too. However, the post-war period did produce a remarkable moment of openness, democracy, and a flourishing of creativity and creation, and a moment where, until 15 years ago, professors and artists had the kind of funding where they could live relatively well in the centers of cities. By the way, New York City is the center of the American literary world and publishing industry. No one in that industry can now afford to live in New York City. I was talking to some literary leaders this week or last week from New York, and they said, we don't even go into the city anymore. These are very important people in the literary world. Most of them live outside of the city now. And I'm like, wow, this is bad. And they're like, yeah, it's really a serious thing that the literary institutions are essentially disappearing.
Yeah, that's an interesting example or testimony to the way our current narrative is supporting or not supporting certain theses. And I've heard the conversation around history. If you don't know history, you don't know what happened in it, right? And so by Neil Postman, who's been somebody I've read a lot of, and he wrote that histories are hypotheses and theories about why change happens. And so it's really important to understand, and I believe that is how you set out, right, in your journey to discover what were the levers and what were the constants throughout the years. And one of the things that I've heard you say in different ways, and I wanted to bring it to the fore just now when you were talking about artists and art and culture being important, was how relationships were more important, more unique, and more valuable than actual ideas. And I fear that now we are like so focused on new ideas that we're missing that whole infrastructure of relationships.
Oh God, yes. No, so within universities right now, and I work at a pretty wonderful university, but I also believe we're at a crossroads. You have the universities becoming very, let's say, business oriented. One of the most important things that can happen at a university is nothing. You get a bunch of smart people sitting around, you have no clue what they are doing. Freedom, what appears to be laziness. Now, you have to have a culture of excellence in there, and we don't always know what that is. But for example, the places that produce Silicon Valley, Stanford and Berkeley and the Bay Area, you just had these wild university cultures. And believe it or not, Silicon Valley grows out of a huge federal investment in radio transmitting technology after the war. This is the CIA and all of our defense industries pumping money through Stanford, state money, to create these technologies, and then venture capital follows. But as both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, for whatever huge drawbacks both of them have, and believe me, I don't think we should idealize either of these people, but we should look at the processes of their real successes. A lot of what they've done is not that successful. Microsoft, to me, is still something which you know, I know it's sort of a monopolistic company, which does not work that well in many cases. But what they did is they were sitting around and they were smart and they saw the inventions that other people were making and they understood their applications. Steve Jobs, who had a much cooler education than Bill Gates, saw that design, especially Italian design, was going to be key in all of this. And by the way, I mean, that's what Apple basically is. It's all this hardware that's been made to be pretty slick and look really cool and function in a way with a lot of Italian and Japanese design around it. And it's been marketed. And that's the whole story of, was it Bill Gates who saw the mouse, somebody else using it, and grabs it and figures out this can be used as a mouse. We can actually use this thing. The guy who invented it doesn't get credit for it. We have all these studies of them as kind of geniuses and of Steve Jobs as this incredible genius. There's no question that the influence of this stuff is just endless. It's just all around me at this very moment. But you have to understand that it came out of this remarkable wealth of bizarre university culture. For example, between Harvard and the Bay Area, where lots of people would drop out of college. However, you also see the limits of that. And you see, for example, you know, Mark Zuckerberg, who dropped out of college and perhaps didn't get such a wonderful education, trying to figure out what to do with all that money and all that power of Facebook, and looking at Facebook turning out to be quite nefarious and not actually such a democratic and wonderful institution after all, as it mines I'm off of Facebook, but it mines our data and steals our information. One of the things I try and teach students is I say, you know, what society are we creating? We have to imagine something, we can invent it. When you fly a plane over Tuscany, there are things that you see that are quite beautiful. When you fly a plane over New Jersey, which is a great center of wealth, trust me, I mean, one of the greatest centers of wealth in the world, you see these cardboard houses built in swamps, and you start to say, who imagined that as a good idea? What society are we imagining, right? And I do think that this kind of cultural wealth with a knowledge of history, with the knowledge of things that have worked and haven't worked, the traditions that we've inherited, the tools that we've inherited, this kind of grand vision of how perhaps to live well, and to remember that humans have built these things, for example, traditional architecture, which can withstand heat and cold without using vast amounts of electricity, old ways of living, arts of living. The Japanese developed in the 17th century a cuisine that's actually consciously healthy. I mean, there are these great creations of societies, some of them fancy, some of them not big fancy societies, that we forget when we do not have cultural, historical wealth and knowledge. And I fear that that is holding us back. And that idea of doing nothing, of just being creative and reading novels, which is so many good things came out of, bad things too, but creative things. The university trying to be efficient and like a business is missing out that being weird and doing nothing often produces much, much more lasting creations. And I know that's true. I've seen it over and over again.
And perhaps read a lot of different things, right? So doing nothing but thinking and feeding the mind.
This, for my students my students are brilliant. This is really harming them in many ways. The mind is one of the things. When I was a graduate student, we were told that books were going to disappear. I'm actually surrounded in rooms and rooms of books here. They didn't disappear. For years, I was asking my lectures halls, would you rather read on a computer or a book? Almost everyone, if it came to a long book, wanted to read it, especially to learn it from a book, not from a screen. It turned out that books that were supposed to become irrelevant are still here. That's because it's very, it has this relationship with the eyes and the brain, memorizing signposts as you go. The same goes for writing and taking notes. Students tell me we just don't read as much now. We're getting our information from our phones and from YouTube. And what that means is the knowledge that you get is not as sophisticated. It is not slow knowledge. I think that the analogy of food and learning things is absolutely the same. That, for example, I have some family visiting tonight. I've been cooking for days and days and days. to cook one thing properly. I mean, really, for days, you want to cook one thing really well. It's not something you do sure, you can cook an egg or some pasta, but if you want to do this thing well, you have to get the products, you have to prepare them, you have to steam them, you have to then roast them, you have to bake them, you have to do all these different things. There's a slowness to this process of learning. And when I was young, that's really interesting. I forced my daughters to paint and to read, and we had to actually force them to do it. It was a real struggle. And then one day they just started doing it. Now they'll read on their own, and I'm just like, this is how you'll grow your brain. I didn't manage to get them piano lessons because music, we know, is the biggest, music and language is the biggest part of the brain. But to develop creativity, to develop an open mind, to develop the capacity to deal with challenges that come at you, right? The unknown. This kind of human development is absolutely key, which is why we have these great universities and all this training. We've been developing this for what? For 800 years, but much longer. We know this works. We are now faced with this great challenge, the movement away from reading, the movement away, for example, the novel, which is the great invention of the 19th century, these complex studies of society where you learn about people and things and institutions. When I was young, we just read. We didn't have anything else to do. So you just have these long periods where you just read great novels and you disappeared into the past, into things that had happened. And history and literature were just a part of life. We've lost those. I am deeply concerned about that loss. And by the way, they were very tied to finance. So there's an old, deep connection between finance going back to the Medici and to even much earlier in the 1200s in Siena, into banks and financiers, funding artists and funding scholars. And because the bankers themselves were people of who read, they read books, they read account books, they read reports, they read religious books, and then they were interested in these secular studies too. These people of disciplined culture, of reading culture, all working together. It still exists in the highest spheres, but I believe that the great democratization after the war of these kinds of knowledges, we're losing them. And that democratization, we see a version of it in Florence and in the Dutch Republic, and even in 18th century Britain and France. And you see this wealth creation, and we do have to call it some kinds of human progress come out of that.
Well, this has been a very rich conversation. I feel like we've gone around the world, and I've had like a personal tutor. Now, in terms of the platform where we're putting this podcast, Traces and Dreams, that is the idea of Traces and Dreams, is to make knowledge accessible and available to people who want to, understand how things work. And this series of conversation on value that I've initiated on the platform is to help people understand the value of things beyond money. That is not just, that there is a broader wealth, a contextual wealth that goes along with human development and human richness. That is important not to lose. Somewhere in your book, you were talking about love and, love for learning and love for, doing things proper. And I want to thank you very much for, putting all of these concepts into, and by the way, I want to encourage listeners to go and get a copy of Free Market, The History of an Idea, because not only it's a very rich book and very generous in terms of knowledge and detail, but it's also super enjoyable. I had no problem following the argument. I had no problem, getting into the details. It was actually kind of fun. It was a little bit of forensic work on my part. And I want to thank you very much for your time today and for sharing of yourself and your knowledge and your research with us.
A great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. You've been listening and watching Conversation on Value. I'm your host, Valeria Maltoni, and I hope you'll join us again for our next conversation on Traces and Dreams. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your network and subscribe. Thank you.